Hey people, welcome to the Run Testers and to our review of the Polar Girt X2 Pro. It's Polar's new Garmin Fenix rival. It now packs a bright AMOLED display, accuracy boosting dual frequency GPS, along with a more comprehensive suite of nav tools. It's also a chunk pricier than the Vantage V3 and the last gen Girt X Pro. So is it worth the extra dollars? Watch our Polar Girt X2 Pro review to find out. What's new then? Well, the Girt X2 Pro is Polar's answer to the Garmin Fenix 7, the Epix 2 Pro and the Coros Vertix. It features many of the upgrades that landed first on the Vantage V3, including a big bright AMOLED display, accuracy boosting dual frequency GPS and the same upgraded sensor tech. There's a faster processor in here too and offline mapping, plus a 43-hour GPS battery life that extends up to 140 hours in lower power modes. Essentially, it's the same watch as the V3, just in a rugged, robust design and with a bigger price tag. Now, Polar released two models of the Girt X2 Pro. There's a regular 79-gram stainless steel version. There's also a lighter 64-gram Pro Titan, which has a titanium chassis. Both variants feature a nicely responsive 1.39-inch 326 ppi resolution AMOLED touchscreen display. That's 15% larger than you got on the previous Polar Girt X Pro, and it comes with a scratch-resistant sapphire crystal glass lens over the top. The screen kicks out an impressive maximum brightness of 1050 nits. That's not quite as punchy as the Apple Watch Ultra 2's 3000 nits, but a notable improvement on the original MIP Girt X Pro display. Like the Polar Vantage V3, the Girt X2 Pro offers dual frequency GPS with the L1 and L5 channels and a new signal boosting antenna. The biosensor setup is the same as you'll get in the Polar Vantage V3. The Polar's Elixir technology, ECG, nightly skin temperature and blood oxygen sensors. It also packs Polar's 4th generation optical heart rate sensor, and there are some updated algorithms in there designed to weed out some wrist-based heart rate inaccuracy, specifically during interval sessions and strength training. Now, navigation smarts have also been improved. The watch now comes preloaded with offline topo maps for North America and Europe. You can download other regions for free with up to 32 gigs of storage. There's also breadcrumb navigation and support for Komoot and Strava routing. Other hardware highlights include a flashlight, though unlike Garmin's popular built-in front-facing torches, Polar actually just turns the screen into the flashlight. It can be slightly harder to aim the beam on those. Polar says it has increased the processor speed by 129% over the Girt X Pro. The Girt X2 Pro is also tested to military standards and is waterproof to 100 meters. Now, as Polar's flagship adventure GPS watch, the Girt X2 Pro isn't cheap. The regular model launches at $749 or so, or £649, while the Titan lands at $870 or so, or £750. That's near 200 leap over the original Girt X Pro. It's also £130 priced on the Polar Vantage V3 and a chunk more expensive than the non-AMOLED Coros Vertix 2S. The £650 Garmin Fenix 7X Solar is probably the closest match for price and size. Now, when it comes to run tracking, the Girt X2 Pro features Polar's most comprehensive suite of training, racing, recovery, activity and sleep tracking, but it's pretty light on shiny new tools. The most interesting additions include some new measurements for tracking speed on ascents and descents. There's VAM and vertical speed, which measures the rate at which you climb or descend, providing more accurate and insightful data when you train in varying terrain. There's also a new 3D speed readout that factors in the speed that you're moving on a horizontal plane and vertically to calculate your true speed as you tackle those ascents. Now, the Girt X2 Pro offers more than 150 sport modes, including a triathlon sport mode. It's along with familiar tools like Training Load Pro, Recovery Pro and Nightly Recharge Recovery Insights that you'll find on most Polar watches. There's Sleep Plus stages and Sleepwise sleep tracking as well. The range of fitness and performance benchmarking tests is probably the best that you'll find on any sport watch, and that includes a new walking test, so new runners can assess fitness without having to go running, which is pretty handy if you're just starting out. Meanwhile, FitSpark workout recommendations serve up daily session ideas linked to your overnight recovery as well. Those are good if you're not really sure what to do for your training. Polar's unique fuel-wise recommendations are also very useful for quantifying your fueling needs for bigger, longer endurance efforts, while the estimated energy usage breakdown for the day and for each workout is sort of a good window into your main fuel sources, at least as a kind of estimate ballpark. Now, like the Vantage V3, the Girt X2 Pro offers non-medical ECG tests, which are great for taking intentional HRV readings. There's SpO2 levels, which show your blood oxygen percentage, along with your baseline and current altitude. And there's nighttime body temperature monitoring as well. Polar's work rest guide is another useful addition here that uses heart rate to advise when to start a new set during a workout, strength workout mainly. Runners also get wrist-based running power here.
So a few general things I noticed during my testing of the Girt X2 Pro. We'll start with the design, which I think is really good. It's a very slender watch and quite lightweight for these big watches. Like if you compare it to the other watches in this category, things like the Epix, the Fenix, the Coros Vertix 2S, like it feels like quite a slim watch on the wrist compared to those. And I actually think the screen is very good as well. For an AMOLED sapphire screen, I think it's maybe the brightest and clearest I've seen. Like when you get sapphire crystal on these AMOLED watches, things like the Epix or the Suunto Race, it can dull the screen a little bit to have that sapphire crystal in front of it, but that's not the case with the Girt X2 Pro. It's got a really nice display. Maps are a nice addition. We saw this with the Vantage V3, and I think the fact they've now added the breadcrumb trail is very important. That's just an obvious feature to have with maps, so it's good that Polar has added that so you can see where you've come even if you're not following a route. They're really nice, bright, clear maps. They're still not as good as Garmin's, which are fully routable maps. You can create routes on the fly. They're a bit more detailed, but they'll certainly get the job done in terms of guiding you through routes or helping you retrace your steps. I'd say the user interface on the watch is generally okay. I don't love every part of it, but it's fine. And the smartwatches are kind of fine. Then again, not as good as what you get with Garmin in terms of music streaming, but probably the bigger problem is connectivity. Like the Polar Girt X2 Pro will just lose my phone at times, and that is just really annoying. It's frustrating when you can't sync your activity over to the phone or you're not getting your notifications through. It just doesn't have as reliable a connection to the phone as other sports watches or certainly smartwatches. Also a few little frustrations with the sports tracking that I've always had with Polar that mean I don't like it quite as much as with other watches. So an example of this is one morning I did a 20 times 60 seconds on, 60 seconds off workout, and I used the Girt X2 Pro, Coros Vertix 2S and the Garmin Epix Pro. Setting that workout up on the Garmin and the Coros is very easy. There's a quick interval setting on both watches. You can do it on the watch. You can set 20 times 1 minute on, 1 minute off, and then add in a warm up and a cool down. And you start your run, you hit the lap button when you want to start the actual intervals, and away you go. With Polar, the whole process was much more frustrating and annoying. Maybe I'm missing something here, but to do this exact same workout and see things was much harder with this watch. So for one, you can set an interval timer on the Girt X2 Pro, but you just have to set 2 timers, so 60 seconds on and then another timer for 60 seconds, and that just starts running when you start the workout. You can't set a warm-up, so you just start the workout and the 60 seconds is counting down, then another 60 seconds will count down, so you've got to kind of start it on that exact thing. You can't do a warm-up, hit lap and start the workout. That's not how it works. To do that, you'd have to create a phased workout in the partner Polarflow app or the Polarflow website. Again, much more of a hassle. And then if you do that, you have to set a target for each of those phases. I don't want a target. I just want to do 60 seconds and run and 60 seconds of jog, and I don't need to have a heart rate zone target or anything like that. But in the end, I did create a phased workout on my phone with a target of all heart rate zones for the 60 seconds on, just so there's no real target at all. The watch wasn't talking to my phone at that point. I had to reset the watch to then get that to sync across. Did the workout, that was all fine. Then it wasn't syncing over to the app afterwards. I had to reset the watch again to make it talk to my phone. And then on the Polarflow app, you can't actually see the breakdown of the 60 seconds, reps you've done. You have to go onto the website to see all those reps, detailed in terms of the distance covered. And just the whole thing was quite annoying, basically, compared to Garmin and Coros, which made it really easy. Just in general, I find Polar sports tracking not quite as intuitive, as easy to use for me with my training as Garmin or Coros's or Suunto's even.
So some general thoughts, and first up on design, I'd argue this is Polar's best looking watch yet. I tested the stainless steel version and I found it generally comfortable to wear. I prefer a nylon strap there. The new AMOLED screen though is really quite excellent. I found it snappy and nicely responsive. It's really bright, really easy to see. I had a real struggle though with the raise to wake, and I find it incredibly laggy and unreliable to the point of frustration on runs. It just doesn't fire when you need it to. I also wanted more control over the screen timeout, which is quite short. Those two things together I think make it quite frustrating. Now when it comes to smartwatch features, the Pro 2 is a long way from rival devices like the Apple Watch. Polar generally still is playing catch up with Garmin on those things. You get smartphone notifications, music controls for your paired phone, but there's no phone-free music or contactless payments here. It's short on those things. On connectivity, I had the same problems as Nick. The Girt X2 Pro has a frustrating habit of really failing to sync with the Polarflow app all the time. It regularly disconnects from the paired phone, so often I found I had to reconnect it and sort of do that pairing again. It's definitely something that Polar needs to improve. It makes it frustrating to use. The addition of offline maps and now breadcrumb navigation, they're really welcome. And though there's no way to create a route on the watch itself, I really love the simplicity of using Strava and Komoot route syncing. Once you've connected your accounts, you can create routes in either platform and they'll sync if the phone actually syncs to the watch. That's when that's working, that is. But so as an example, on my first ever trip up to the Lake District to check out the 13 Valleys Ultra Trail course, I was able to use Strava on the train, find a really popular 11-mile route on there, sync it with the watch and follow it easily, running virtually straight off the train. And there's no turn-by-turn navigation for Strava there, though there is for Komoot. Now, maps also really come alive on that big bright AMOLED screen, and the Grit X2 Pro's faster processing, I think, makes moving around the maps, particularly where you need to navigate off your screen, a little bit snappier. I still find using the physical buttons to zoom in and out of those maps somewhat fiddly. I just go to my phone.
So it comes to GPS accuracy on the watch. I find the Polar Girt X2 Pro to be pretty good. I find the step up in accuracy with Polar that we saw with the Vantage V3 with the dual band GPS on that is also here with the Girt X2 Pro. It is considerably better than what we've seen from Polar in the past, but it's not quite top tier for me. So throughout testing, I've been using the Girt X2 Pro at the same time as a Garmin Epix Pro and a Coros Vertix 2S. And I say of the three, the Polar is the least accurate of those three, but it's pretty close. Like, I don't think there's a real problem with the GPS on the Polar Girt X2 Pro. It's accurate enough that I could use it for all my training, but isn't quite as accurate as Garmin or Suunto's in particular. So if I look at the GPS tracks using those watches, they're usually pretty much all in line, but the Polar's the one that makes more mistakes. It cuts more corners. It has, crosses the road incorrectly and stuff like that. It tends to end up with a slightly different distance as a result, but nothing too bad. It also takes longer to lock on at the start of a run than other watches. And I did have one run where it went completely wrong, like was really cutting off huge swathes of my run, just having me completely wrong. So like I say, testing it against those other two watches, which are very good for GPS, the Polar is the least accurate, but overall I would say it is fine. Like, I could train with this watch pretty happily, even as someone who's very into GPS, but I would prefer the GPS accuracy of Garmin and Suunto in particular, which are a level up on what you're getting here with the Girt X2 Pro, but it's a small level. It's still a pretty accurate watch overall.
So when it comes to GPS accuracy, I tested the Grit X2 Pro up against other dual frequency packing watches, including the Vantage V3, sometimes the Garmin Forerunner 965, and the Coros Vertix 2S. In general, I found the accuracy good, largely within an acceptable 10% margin for error on my usual known distance routes. I also did a City of London half marathon race test, and the Grit X2 Pro came up slightly short at 13.03 miles. During the Adidas Manchester Marathon, it matched the Vantage V3 and the Garmin Forerunner 965 dual frequency modes within 0.1 miles. I clocked 0.2 miles over that official distance as well. Again, this is pretty standard performance when it comes to GPS. The reliability definitely dropped significantly in the power saving every 2 minutes mode. It was more than half a mile out on 2 shortish test runs and magnified over an ultra distance. I think that might become too unreliable to really be all that useful. When you dig into the GPS tracks in detail, the Polar Girt X2 Pro doesn't always snap to the roads with 100% reliability, but in my experience, very few watches consistently do that. The Apple Watch Ultra is probably the best, but the Grit X2 Pro was on par with the Garmin Forerunner 965 dual frequency. But in my test, I found the Grit X2 Pro dual frequency accuracy was really quite good.
When it comes to the heart rate accuracy, this has been pretty up and down for me throughout my testing. I say it's probably been better than I've had with Polar in the past. Like, even with the Vantage V3, I very rarely had completely accurate runs. I did have one very good run with the Grit X2 Pro. Actually, that 60 seconds on, 60 seconds off session I've talked about already. It had very good heart rate during that, rising and falling in line with the chest strap. So throughout testing, I've been using a chest strap on one of the watches I've been using at the same time, and can see that the Polar is often wrong. Occasionally it's just really high for the entirety of a run, which is of no use, and that skews all your training data for a while. But it has been okay for most of my runs, especially when the conditions are warmer. In colder conditions, it's more likely to go wrong, and as with most of these watches, or indeed all of these watches, I would pair a chest or an armband to it to get more accurate data if you're going to use the training analysis at all, or do your workouts based on heart rate. But if you don't want to use any external straps, the sensor here is okay. I think it is probably a little bit better than what I've seen from Polar in the past, but you are still going to have errors there cropping up, and that's how much that annoys you is going to depend on the kind of runner you are and how much you use heart rate.
On heart rate performance, the optical heart rate sensor accuracy was also good. Not entirely infallible, but on the majority of my workouts and during my race test at the Manchester Marathon, the Grit X2 Pro matched the Polar H10 chest strap very closely with identical max and average heart rates. It occasionally struggled at the start of runs. For example, on a treadmill session that I did, you can see here that it eventually settled down. So, sometimes it can happen with opticals. But overall, in my test, it was about as solid as optical heart rate gets. Now, when it comes to battery life, Polar has tweaked the names of its battery power modes across all of its watches. It now officially lists 3 new modes: performance training mode, eco training mode, and smartwatch mode. These aren't preset modes that you can switch to on the watch itself as you might with a Suunto. They're simply new labels to describe a group of settings that Polar now uses to report its battery life overall. Now, you can refine your power settings on the watch choosing either single frequency all systems or dual frequency GPS, and have a GPS frequency of every 1 second, 1 minute, 2 minutes or off for each of them. But power customization probably isn't quite as granular as you might get on a Garmin. Now on paper, the Polar Girt X2 Pro battery life offers more staying power than the Girt X Pro. You'll get up to 43 hours in the highest accuracy dual frequency performance mode, up from 35 hours, and 140 hours in the eco training mode. That's up from 132 hours in that longest lasting mode. In smartwatch mode with no GPS training, the Girt X2 Pro should last up to 10 days compared to 6 on the original Girt X Pro. Now in my tests, the staying power wasn't quite at Garmin Enduro 2 or Coros Vertix 2 levels, but it's still impressed. The headlines included overnight battery burn average of a 3%, a 1 hour run in performance training mode, that's with all systems plus dual frequency on, burned 4%, a 3.5 hour marathon in performance training mode, that's all systems plus dual frequency every 1 second, burned 9%, a 2 hour 54 marathon test in performance mode, burned 7%, a 1 hour run with single frequency GPS every 2 minutes, burned 2%, a 5 hour run in dual frequency mode, burned 15%. Now one big improvement is Polar's overnight battery burn. Sleep and recovery tracking used to rinse the battery whilst you slept, but that's dropped to an average of 3% per night, which is pretty standard against the Garmin's, though the Coros Vertix 2S is even more stingy. That only drops 1% overnight. Now in my test with the kind of performance training mode settings, my watch came up just short of the claimed 43 hours. I got close to 40 hours, but there's plenty of juice here for tackling day-long or multi-day ultras if that's what you're interested in. On one full charge, I also clocked around 13 hours runtime in 11 days before needing to charge.
So the battery life on the Girt X2 Pro has been pretty good for me, I would say. I've been using it mostly for lots of little runs rather than long runs because I've been testing it before and after a marathon, so I haven't been doing like lots of very long runs with the watch, but it has been lasting probably 4 or 5 days on a charge with running or doing some kind of activity every day and using the GPS. I've always had the GPS in the most accurate mode. I've had the screen set to always on, which just shows that time there. It doesn't really give you much of an always on screen, but it does use a little bit more battery, of course. In the week after my marathon, I didn't do much activity at all. It did last, longer than that 4 or 5 day period, kind of more like 6 days because, I wasn't doing much activity. It's pretty comparable to me to something like the Garmin Epics in the normal size, but you can get AMOLED watches with longer battery life these days. The Suunto Race and the Garmin Forerunner 965 both have longer battery life with AMOLED displays set to always on mode, and the Garmin Epix Pro in the 51mm size lasts a lot longer. It's about 10 days, even with lots of training with the screen always on. But it wasn't a big problem, I'd say. Only I would say it does seem to charge a little bit slower than other watches. And I don't know if it's the charger I've been using. I've tried a few different ones, but yeah, it doesn't seem very fast to charge, and that's quite annoying. So you have to leave it a fair while for it to juice up, but I'll keep continuing to experiment with different plugs, but it has been notably slower to charge than other AMOLED watches I've been using. So verdict is going in. I expected the Polar Girt X2 Pro to basically be the Vantage V3 with this more rugged design with the sapphire screen and the metal bezel and all that, and that is basically what you have here, and it's got very similar performance to the Vantage V3, which is overall very good performance, I would say. I've got some annoyances with the sports tracking. I don't think the GPS is as good as the very best on the market. Heart rate accuracy continues to be so-so, as with all optical heart rate monitors, but it's a pretty nice watch to use. I like the design of it a lot. Really nice screen. Feels quite nice on the wrist, and it's a watch I'd be happy to use to guide my training. But if you're looking at buying this watch, the price is a huge problem. It's really expensive, and you're simply going to get better watches for less. Even within Polar's range, the Vantage V3 obviously doesn't have some of these rugged design features which you might find essential, but if you don't find those essential, the V3 is the same watch essentially, and smaller, it's lighter, and it's a lot cheaper. And you can go to Garmin and get simply superior watches with AMOLED displays or without AMOLED displays for less. You can find the Epix and the Fenix for less, the Garmin 965 or 955, and just getting a whole load more features with Garmin, and the features that both watches have across Polar and Garmin. I'd say that Garmin do better. Their navigation features are better. They've got more smart features. The GPS is a little better. The way they do structured workouts and general things like that I find better and more intuitive. And there's also the Suunto Race, which is cheaper again, and that has the sapphire crystal screen, the metal body, AMOLED display, longer battery life, slightly better GPS. Like the interface with Suunto isn't quite as good. It's a bit laggy sometimes, but it is still a very good watch that I liked, and I probably would prefer to use over the Girt X2 Pro, and it's also a lot cheaper. If you are bringing a watch out in this top tier of sports watches, I think Garmin are so dominant. Like, if you're not going to be able to go toe-to-toe on features, which no one is able to at the moment, I'd say just Garmin has more features, very well-established features, all very well polished. You've got to try and undercut them on price, which is what Suunto did with the Race, and that made it a very compelling option, I'd say, on the market. With the Girt X2 Pro, Polar have come in with a more expensive watch that isn't as good, and that just makes it impossible to recommend.
So verdict then, and overall, I've been pretty impressed with the Polar Girt X2 Pro. I think it's a really good, solid all-rounder, and it definitely closes the gap on Garmin's leading adventure watches. But even with that punchy display, slick looks, the snappy performance, the good accuracy, those much improved navigation skills, I think it's still not quite as accomplished or fully featured as a similarly priced Garmin Fenix 7X Solar. The significant price hike over the Grit X Pro can be explained, I think, in part by the new hardware, but unless you're wedded to the rugged design, I think I'd strongly recommend looking at the Vantage V3, which offers essentially the same tools and performance for a big chunk less.